Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today at our API Academy virtual workshop. I'm Bill. I'm head of the API Academy, and with me is John from HCL. He'll be doing our keynote this afternoon, or this morning, or this afternoon. Following him will be Aran, also with the API Academy, as well as Jaime. They'll be discussing API design. Following them will be Thorne with the API Academy. He'll be discussing service mesh with microservices, and we'll end the day with Bryan Whitmarsh talking about API testing and strategy. So let me get started with how to use your control panel with GoToWebinar. You can expand or collapse your panel clicking on the orange arrow. This allows you basically to view and select your audio. It also allows you to type in questions, which we will not get to during today's workshop, but we will address them later. And I want you please to note that today everybody is muted for recording purposes. This webinar will be available later on today through the link you used today, as well as on API Academy. Our agenda today is very simple. I'll be discussing the API Academy real quickly, the website and the certification program. Following me will be John giving our keynote on API strategy with API governance and agile execution. Jaime and Aran will be talking about API design, specifically REST and CRUD versus GraphQL. Jay will follow him with microservices with service mesh. And then, as I mentioned before, Bryan will wrap up the day with API testing and monitoring, a quick discussion on that. So the API Academy, for those of you not familiar with us, it's a team of industry experts worldwide, and it exists for one reason and one reason only: best practices for API strategy, design, and security. It consists of a website, it consists of workshops and industry events. If you had asked me in January about workshops, I would have told you that we have 12 scheduled throughout 2020 around the world. As well as industry events, specifically we are, or were, a global sponsor for API Days. And we were actually going to conduct several of our workshops in conjunction with API Days. However, as you know, the world kind of has been turned upside down, and we're doing virtual workshops this year, but we do look forward to seeing you in person next year. We recently introduced the certification program. I'll talk more about that in a minute. And the API Academy is sponsored by Broadcom. For those of you who haven't seen the API Academy website, or if you've just been looking at the homepage and clicking on what's new, I wanted to show you a couple of new things. If you go to the top right and click on Explore, you'll see not only do we have various subjects broken out through strategy, design, API management in general, security, app development, and microservices, but we also do it by role now. So API developers, app developers, architects, business leaders, there's content for each of you.
Bill, sorry to jump in. Should we be seeing a deck here or a presentation?
Yes, as a matter of fact. Thank you for...
I just sent you a message, and I can see that we know that you can't see our deck because I sent you that. I think you may be sharing the wrong screen.
How about now?
That makes more sense. Thanks. Sorry to interrupt, but I thought it was important.
Thank you for pointing that out. That's the joy of GoToWebinar. You never know which screen is being shown until somebody points that out. So going back to go under Explore, you can see not only by subject, but also by role. Also on the upper right is a new tab on Get Certified. Recently, the API Academy created the first independent education and certification program for API strategy and design delivered at no charge. It's a self-paced course for API designers, API security architects, and API product managers, and more are coming. It's all about best practices, delivering them on demand. Each course completion delivers a certification, a certificate, and a badge. We definitely encourage you to show those off on LinkedIn, show off what you've accomplished. If you complete all three of those courses, you will receive an API Academy certified badge. That's the gold badge on the lower right. The API Designer and API Security Architect courses are available today, and API Product Manager will be available sometime in September. So let's jump into it. API Strategy and Design at Acme Inc. Now, Acme is a fictional multinational financial institution, but this may sound familiar to many of you listening today. It's a multinational financial institution. It's using an antiquated system based on an IBM mainframe. Most of its data is sitting on that mainframe. Management is very stoic. They have resisted change for the last 30 years, that the PC is a fad, that iPhones, Android devices, iPads, etc., they're all a fad. So they haven't made any changes to their system whatsoever. The board of directors recently said, yeah, you guys are out of here, and put in a new team basically to modernize our app infrastructure and to get back the lost market share. The first thing that Acme did was reach out to one of the companies that definitely groks the whole idea of API strategy and design, HCL. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to John, who's going to talk about specifically API governance and agile execution. Take it away, John. And John, you are muted.
Oh, sorry about that. Okay, so greetings, everybody. Sorry we couldn't be doing this in person like Bill said. That was the plan. But let's go through this. What I'm hoping we can do here is get through this material quickly enough that it'll leave a little bit of time for questions from you all. Every customer that we go into and work in this space, they have some things in common, they have some things that are different. So welcome to the governance and agile execution discussion. I am John Cocke. I spent the past 3 years working with colleagues to stand up an API management practice and delivering related services to our API management customers. Prior to that time, I spent most of the last 20 years in the enterprise service bus space, or in other words, the applications integration space. Much of my previous background, focuses on turning data into information. Much about the promotion of APIs, including API First, requires the same kind of sponsorship and funding that we needed in the ESB space. The difference is APIs generally have a much faster time to value than back-end monolithic services, which are often dependent on ESB services attached to that mainframe that Bill told you about. APIs drive the loosely coupled, coarse-grained architectures that SOA always laid claim to but couldn't quite get a hold of. The challenge for both is organizational. The same structures that could not stand up small, limited purpose SOA service architectures may also challenge enterprise adoption of microservice-based architectures. Many still have the notion that technology can overcome the will of people and how they choose to organize and budget themselves. So we will review some of the approaches to that road mapping and leveraging those people resources, including some proven artifacts that we've used. And together we will read through something we call the API Management Top 10 Questions list. We're going to use a scenario based on Acme Corporation, a lending institution, as Bill said. We'll spend some time today talking about the API Evangelist. Acme came to believe that that was the best hope to prevent organizational stagnation from defeating adaptive initiatives. And so we've incorporated API Evangelist as a strategic part of their business. Next slide, please, Bill. So this material, we've divided the material in this discussion into 3 areas, or actually 4 areas. The intent is to have a waterfall approach through the material so that you look in one area and then we go to the next and you have a building process with what we're sharing with you. Segment 1 is what we call API Management Governance Basics. It refers to what I would call the static aspects of governance. We're focusing on API management, but these views, these generic roles, and these flows are a starting place. If you choose to use this material and start mapping your organization to this approach, your results may vary. Segment 2, organize to adapt. Only 12% of companies that we work with say that their agile frameworks and initiatives are succeeding. Lack of engagement by senior management is most often the cause. Many of them look at what goes on in a scrum or a sprint, and they don't understand how to tie that back to the business value they seek. I wouldn't think that any of this is a surprise to you folks on the line. We'll look at an organizational construct that helped another customer adopt agile practices where API management is concerned. So we're showing you the work we did for Acme, but there's different approaches to this, and so there's another not mentioned experience that's embedded in this. Segment 3 again will be API management top 10 questions. A year ago, a group of us got together to figure out how to make the API world plainer and more transparent to both customers and colleagues who needed some clarity around, what's the effect of APIs in their world. And so we involved API practitioners and business people in building, this top 10 questions list and seeing if it was helpful to people. And finally, we'll take a brief look at DevOps execution. The API management cycle really demands the same type of DevOps orchestration rigor as anything else. However, there's some unique aspects of API management and its associated tools and infrastructure that present some challenges. Next slide, please, Bill. So let's take a look at Acme and their business. And this is a simplified view. But if you look at the lending business that they're in, there were 5 main business functions. You're a slide ahead. I think you're a slide ahead of me, Bill, but that's okay. And Bill, hold on a second. Well, we got a mismatch on decks here, Bill. So
give me 1 second. I actually had a PowerPoint crash, and I might have pulled up the old version. Let me bear with me 1 second. My apologies.
Yeah. It's version 6 that I sent you yesterday evening. And so you get version 6 up, and you should be able to go to slide 3, and then we'll be back in sync.
Yep, bear with me. I'm scrambling for it now.
I'll take the motorcycle.
I think the motorcycle was the giveaway, right? There was a giveaway today.
Yeah, that's it. Okay, we're on the right one now. My apologies.
There you go.
Okay.
Yeah. You got it color coded for Broadcom, but that's okay. It looks like the same material. So essentially, the point we were making here is that what we did was when we worked with them, there's sort of a progression that they wanted to make, right? So they started with what we call an online credit application, which is really initially all they wanted to do was to put an API out there that would allow any external customer to connect to their institution and put a loan application in. And we're not going to examine all the back office processing that goes on behind that. But the other 4 areas were really what we're doing with API management is we're going to help them build out that initial managed API, and we're going to stand up most, if not as much of the infrastructure as we can that will make it easier for them to go on and knock off these others. So next slide, please. Okay, one more time. Okay, so this is a simplified view of what we found, and we find this virtually every account we go into. The silos are there. Job 1 is to go get to know those people, figure out what they're doing now. Some type of a fledgling API program is usually underfoot. In the case of Acme, there was some activity going already. But regarding the silos, I would point out that there are very successful organizations out there that run a siloed business. They work well if there's strong accountability and transparency, one silo to the other, daily communication, no rivalry, minimum of turf type issues. So, so we find this, everywhere we go. These kinds of businesses are usually prospering simply because of good people and hard work. Next, please. Okay, so Acme, the first thing they did, where the initial investment came before it actually rippled, to us from an implementation and how do you do it point of view, was they stood up a digital marketing group in their line of business, right? So, there's a division of this lending institution that their job is originating and managing loans for a certain line of business. So they assigned responsibility, really sort of an adaptive type group within that business, and they called it digital marketing. And so the next part of that organization was what they call a digital software solutions group. And so that's where they took some of their best existing IT personnel, as well as visionary one particular senior executive who really understood the business, had a track record of delivery, and they gave him this opportunity to stand up this digital software solutions group. The initial funding for that group was what they were tasked with doing was to API enable that back-end legacy loan system, yielding an online credit application to replace an existing 800 number email type channel. The API was placed under the management of an API gateway, and so now we're looking towards, how did it end? It was placed under the management of an API gateway, which contained the policy to secure the incoming user request, as well as back-end Acme data, and orchestrate the interaction with that online credit app, with their back-end, which happened to be a large ERP. In fact, it was an SAP instance exposed by a rather aging ESB through SOAP RPCs. So next, please. So taking the silos away, let's take a final look at this scheme. Digital software solutions in the middle, connected on the left with digital marketing, leveraging existing IT operations capabilities on the architecture side, and with the immediate objective to stand up this online consumer loan capability. So next, please. Okay. So the API management framework that Acme adopted from us is an organizational approach that's aimed at associated challenges to stand up what we call an elastic API program. Next, please, Bill. So, and what we're showing you now is sort of the key framework, sort of the building blocks that these have been in existence for several years, even longer than I became involved with this particular method. So the enterprise API strategy it's a product of Acme's value ops assessment and associated portfolio funding decisions, and that's what manifests itself at this level. API, and then to the API management governance, which comes next. We deliver that, and we delivered that to Acme in the form of an API management charter, and which you'll see some of the artifacts later that are part of that. It contains an API strategy and a roadmap. Next, please, Bill. So the next layer down are sort of three of the, we're getting more granular now. The organizational structure. What are the roles and responsibilities? We're starting to identify those. We're starting to identify interview schedules from this. Who are the people that we're going to have to talk to derive what this really looks like and what it needs to look like? We're gonna work with them to begin to discover use cases and trends across intended APIs and prioritize onboarding capabilities onto the platform. And some of that onboarding has to do with application related capability enabled by the targeted APIs, and some of it has to do with necessary infrastructure. So we're keeping the infrastructure operations people sort of on our right elbow the whole time. And then as far as standards and policies, standards and policies get sort of overhyped. But we really, what we're doing here is we're identifying one or two people at the table who think this way, rather than just arbitrary spend going out on policy and standard boilerplate. So we didn't spend a lot of effort on this. We sort of let it develop as a derivative. Next, please. Okay, so now you see the framework beginning to develop. Again, on the left, what are the business objectives and the market drivers? It's really how we want people to think about working within this framework. And then dropping down to the center level below, let's start to identify and dialogue with Acme about the API management tools and the components, and start to look at what the job is to actually stand up the platform. And by doing that, we're beginning to give them some clues as to what the task of the API management team is going to be. Next, please. So now here we get to really the core of the method. The work products, and artifacts that are going to be the product of our assessment and the roadmap that we're going to begin to lay out for the customer, they're based on these program activities. And I should stress that these activities vary depending on who the customer is. We don't go in with a pre-prescribed set of program activities and say this is what you're going to focus on, because again, as I said earlier, every customer we go into, and Acme did too, there was already a fledgling API program going, and there was some excellence and some awareness. So there was some areas where we didn't really need to say, okay, we're going to get this into the top 10 target activities. Okay, so next, please. So we're going to flash that at you one time just so you realize, how important it is. Every work product, or not every, but most of the work products that we're going to create going through this strategy and roadmap engagement, the keys on the left side of those artifacts are going to be those program activities, and we're going to measure how we're doing, or how we need to do. Okay, so next, please. So to a final look, and I don't know what part of this material is going to be distributed, but whenever somebody asks me what is it that you do for a living, it's pretty much it's all captured on this one slide with this one framework. So this is a brief look. Maybe you take a screenshot of it. Maybe this will be the basis for some questions later. Next slide, please. So looking at, now we start to look at the organization and the flow of the work, okay? And so this is a somewhat more progressive view of Acme in the beginning. In reality, they had digital marketing identified. They had digital support solutions, right? So that was going to be the liaison group between the business and the existing IT shop. But what they didn't know was, okay, so how do we marshal the results that we're looking for? So digital marketing is on the business side. Digital support solutions, is initially focused on one product. That's what they're funded for. And so then what we did early on, because prior client experiences, we knew that if you want to cut through the stagnation, and if you want to give people a real chance to run, we introduced the concept of the API Evangelist. And that person is really, and it's a bridge role between the business and the provider and consumer side developers, as well as being strong enough technically to look over to the DevOps path to production side and be able to play. Our view of an evangelist is somebody who could operate in a senior architect role if they had to, but this person, wants to spend more time with the business, wants to get their performance metrics a little bit more on the hook on the business side, as well as the technical delivery side. So the product owner is, there's another person who is part senior business analyst. They lend systems legacy application architecture expertise. In other words, they come in knowing how that back-end system works, that back-end SAP system. They got strong data modeling skills, because at the end of the day, if you can't figure out what the code is doing, as long as you know what the data is doing, then you're going to be in good shape. So to sum up, the product owner question came up yesterday on, well, what's the difference between a product owner and an API owner? And in our view of things, an API owner owns a component. They have pretty good understanding of what comes in and what goes out, and how it's being secured, and how you scale it and all that. But the product owner really owns the whole, in this case, the whole online credit application, plus what comes before it, plus what's going to come after it, right? And is an agile, savvy person. So we don't play the API owner role. We didn't play that into Acme, but we have a different approach to it that we'll show you in a bit. Next slide, please. So, okay, I think you need to go one more. Okay, let's see. Are you going backwards? Let's see. Okay, no, oh yeah, go, you need to go back. I'm sorry. I think we're missing a slide. Well, let me go ahead and describe what I'm looking at. Oh, I got rid of the slide. Okay, sorry about that. I'm thinking about previous. All right, so let's get past. Let's go past that slide, Bill. And okay, so stop there. So we're coming now. We're going to come back to the 10 program activities. So next, please, Bill. So this is an example of an artifact, and you can go ahead and go next, so we can let them see the artifact more clearly. This is what we call the activities resource matrix. It dimensions those program activities to the people and the entities that have the stake and that have a job to do, right? And so this is the first time with Acme that we actually took all those program activities down the left-hand side, and then we laid out their organization, the way it was set up. And we went through some iterations on that. We didn't understand exactly where to place the information security people in this. And so we went through but we just made some notes in here as to who you are, what the roles and responsibilities are, what you're going to do, what are the drivers behind, what you're doing around this task or this program activity. Okay, next, please. All right, so here's another artifact, and this is in this one there's heavy interview activity that went into the the capture of this data and the scoring. Acme, like many of our customers, had an API program in flight when we got there. And so we worked with them to assess their current capability and with some recommendations using the CMM approach as to how they wanted to go forward. Again, the CMM goals are captured around those same program activities. We came in the door, we came in the door knowing what the optimized state was. We pretty much know, and the other folks that are going to present to you, I mean, we've been in this business long enough to know, how should it end? We know how it should end. But that's more around platform capability. How it should end from the standpoint of the business goals that they're chasing always is different. So we gapped their current capabilities against what we consider to be a minimum viable product, and so we could roll out. And so when we got to the end, we scored them. And if you can see the scoring factors under MVP, improved and optimized, you can see that the scores were not too high in the beginning. And so this particular exercise, and we probably spent 4 weeks interviewing people and collecting information, and then we brought this information back to them. And the VP who runs the Digital Support Solutions Group, this was helpful to him in knowing, how he should budget against, what he was trying to do. So next slide, please. Okay, so this, I think some of you on the line will have seen this before. At the same time as we're doing organizational alignment and helping Acme figure out who's going to do what, how much resource and bandwidth do they need in certain areas, we after probably a month into our engagement, this is where we started engaging closely with the IT operations people, some of the senior architects that had been moved from the back end into digital support resources. And what you're seeing here are use cases. These are sort of pre-baked use cases that we come in with. These use cases probably represent 90% of the infrastructure challenges, security issues, two-factor authentication issues. How are you going to interface with, let's say, back-end MQ series messaging systems? All those kind of things that don't readily relate to the online credit application. At some point, the performance requirements, the security requirements, latency issues, all of those things, we're going to have a profile for all those things, and one or more of these use cases are going to play. So, this is a workshop item also, because what we end up doing is we end up having a series of, I think it was like 10 different workshops, whiteboard, going through these use cases, having their architects, getting level set with their architects about how these challenges appear or how they think about these things in their environment. So, and it was fun. We had a good architect working on that. Next slide, please. Okay, top 10. Like I said, we put together a group of people to help us do this. This is really aimed at some of the simple questions that people have. So we'll just sort of read through these. Next slide, please. What is API management? So it is, in my mind, it's the core of digital transformation. Because unless you want to do unmanaged point-to-point, unmanaged APIs doing point-to-point communication with back-end systems with no rhyme or reason around it, then that's why you need API management. Next question, please. Okay. So what is API first? I think the summary of it is when, and without reading the words here, when a business capability comes up some kind of whether it's an incremental need on top of something that you already do, or whether it's something new. The idea is for let's think about existing capabilities in terms of what APIs do we have that do those things, instead of thinking immediately to, let's take that SAP system, for example. Well, you know, how would we do that with SAP? All right. So part of this is a state of mind. Okay. And so then, so whether you have those APIs available that you can, you know, bring them together or whatever, but the idea is you're thinking about driving the business with APIs as opposed to back-end development. Back-end development becomes subservient, right? Jay's going to talk about microservices. Microservices are an architectural pattern. They're not necessarily an application's business function result. So the point is if you're thinking API first, you're really simplifying what's needed. What do you need in? What do you need out? How do we stand up an API? Who's going to do it? Next slide, please. Okay. So how do I support my client's security needs by federating my enterprise security? Real simple. The answer to that is federation. The point is you need to secure your internal data, right, from the outside. Your external partners also need to know that you're securing the payloads of their data, and if it's a loan system, it's all PII. They need to know that you're securing their payloads coming in. So the idea is when you're looking at API security, you're looking at the universe. You're not just looking at protecting your information. Next slide, please. Okay. So why do I need to use two-factor authentication? Pretty simple, and I think someone coming behind me will talk about this, but you know, the simplest way to secure something is with API keys, and all that does is let's say it tells a gateway that here's an application coming in. So it's application level security. Then you go from there, you know, to authentication, maybe using some kind of single sign-on capability. But in reality, you might get authenticated, but you know, two-factor says, hey, I'm going to circle your identity back to some other device. It's pretty simple, but and we all are doing nothing but that. But when you're looking at API management, you still have to walk through those three levels when you're looking at how do you want to create a gateway service, for example, to handle a request. Next question, please. Okay, so versioning. The simple answer to this is either you create multiple versions of APIs and you go through the nightmare of trying to figure out, of trying to make each one available externally, and that's a nightmare. Or what you do is you version the capabilities the different capabilities that you're offering to your external clients. You version them within one API. And you make the API, you make that one, you only have one API. You never have more than one API. And that API is smart enough to where, what it really is not only that, but the policy that's running on the gateway is smart enough to be able to determine who gets to use what instead of having a separate version. So that's a simple answer to that one. Okay, next. How do I make business APIs available to my external clients or my internal developers? Okay, so the point is you're doing development work both for external and internal environments. And so it's, you know, you're serving two different audiences. The horsepower in your API development world really has to be your internal developers. But then that horsepower has to be backed up by how do you make those available to external developers. Bill, let's go ahead and skip all the way through the questions because I want to make sure that we get to. Let's see. I'm going to go I want to get to the organized to adapt section. I'm seeing that my clock says I got 9 minutes left.
And I just had PowerPoint crash again, so give me 1 second to get it back online.
Yeah, it's okay. Anyway, so for everybody's information, I mean, those APIM top 10 questions, they're available. We'll provide those to you if you want to look at them. They make a good primer for people that need to understand what's going on in this world.
Screen back up.
You bet. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's take a quick look at the API Evangelist, and I think we've talked enough about it already. In our approach to this, it's the cornerstone role, right? This kind of person, in case you want to know what kind of caliber this is somebody that in my view, they're on a CIO or a CTO career track. They're that strong. The challenge is bandwidth. When you got a resource like that, you got to be real selective in how you use them. So for sure, in a greenfield like Acme, it made sense because they needed to get big. They needed to get these points on the board quickly. They needed to show digital marketing that they could do this. So and standing up that evangelist role sort of gave them a hammer, if I can say it that way. So the API Evangelists had strong relationships with line of business owners, business analysts, product owners, stewards, and architects, and we'll see the role of steward in just a minute. So it's a real leadership role. So next slide, please. So we work with a concept in our group called Build to Adapt. And so this is a tool, this is the first tool that the evangelist uses, and they go in and they're going to triangulate, they're actually going to quadrangulate the challenge with management as well as their colleagues around. So these are questions, are you building the right things slowly, or are you building the wrong things quickly? And so, the goal is to be adaptive and to minimize risk. So, our experience with the evangelist at Acme was that person got it. They knew what needed to happen. They knew the people dynamics, both on the business side and in the digital support solution side, and on the silo IT operations side. But they still went through this exercise with digital marketing, and it helped create some bonding. So just real quick, so it's not a Myers-Briggs type of assessment. So it's they're really looking to see, where are the constraints. Next slide, please. So this is not a new concept to many. API first, it starts with internal APIs because, your knowledge of how your business works is in the code that you run right now. And some of them are APIs and some of them are traditional legacy and some COBOL code in there running on mainframes. So, but the point is that API first is not contract first development. In other words, the contract comes later. What is it that we're trying to do? How do we need to do it? And then let's put that in the form of a contract. And the other key piece of this is, and this has been said many ways, treating APIs as the critical component. In other words, all the focus by business and IT management is on where's that API? What's it doing? Show me our progress by where we are on that API. Don't show me our progress by, again, where we are on back-end code or architectures that I don't understand. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's go one more. What is a managed API? This is pretty simple. It's, when I was looking at a DevOps orchestration architecture the other day, and so I So I said, where are all the APIs that are floating around in there that may have to be revisioned, that may have to be promoted, and this and that. So an unmanaged API essentially is, and it's not a bad thing. You might have a GitHub to Jenkins integration within your DevOps orchestration chain, and that's all API enabled. And so those are APIs that are within your space, that are within your DevOps orchestration pipeline, but you don't own responsibility for that API. That's managed by somebody else, okay? So let's, one more time. Thanks, Bill. So the key is, and this is part of sizing the task at hand for API management. What are the APIs that I have to manage and why? Okay, and most of those, will be business application function related, but some of them will be APIs that you've got stood up on the infrastructure side that you need, that need to scale, or that even internal to internal that need to be secured. So the key is here, know what you have to manage, know what you don't have to manage. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm showing 2 minutes. Bill, how much time are you showing for me?
Oh, you're good. You're good till the top of the hour.
Okay, good deal. All right, so from center of excellence to a cooperative, I made a living as an architect, basically staking out turf that I understood, and then saying, we need to have a center of excellence. And in order to do that, we need to have resources, and resources involve payroll. And that was fun. And it was fun, like in the ESB days. We had a big customer in Memphis. We'll just leave it as big customer in Memphis. That was a forerunner in the ESB space, and they set up this massive center of excellence, and they brought in a top 4 consulting firm and so forth, and they spent a ton of money, and the connectivity between those skills and what the business, the incremental needs of the business on a day-to-day basis were not there. So when we came into Acme, we brought this idea of, hey, you have this lending line of business, and you have, in their case, they had staked out 2 or 3 different developer teams, and there's a difference between an API developer team and an API management team. So we basically, instead of doing center of excellence, we set up this cooperative idea that says 2 or 3 domains that are part of a line. A domain is a business area within a line of business. So 2 or 3 domains are going to be supported by one API management team cooperative. And so that's the scheme. So next slide, and we'll get a look at that. Okay, thank you. So cooperative, again, it's staffed to support 3, maybe 4 domains within a line of business. The box on the left represents a domain agile development. Hold on a second. My timer went off. Okay. So the box on the left represents the domain agile development. That's really multiple developer teams is what you're seeing there. And you're also seeing multiple release trains. And so that, and what this particular customer, and this, just so you know, this is a different customer that I'm talking to you about now. They have a very strong commitment to SAFe. And what they wanted to do was they wanted to merge their SAFe agile approach with API management. And fortunately for them, they had enough experience with API management that they understood what an API management team needs to do as a center of excellence. What we worked with them on was, okay, so how do you reorganize it to be a little bit more of a cooperative? So the blue boxes on the right are also part of the domain, right? I.e. the business side. But those people those are matrix resources. This particular customer that I'm referring to also has the silos. And the success of an API management team also depends heavily on working relationships, with those people on the backside. So let's real quickly visit who the players are. So next slide, please.
Which slide are you looking for?
Yeah, I was one behind you. Sorry. So again, we start with the evangelist, and what that person and the link between the evangelist who is in the API management team, but has, if you looked at that drawing, they've got reach into the agile teams, and they've also got reach back into the back end and so forth. So a key job for that evangelist at this point is we've got this role of a steward, the concept of an API steward. The API steward, it could be what some of you all think of as a senior API architect. I know one that lives in the Vancouver area. The point is that person is focused on the domain, on the domain's API development and API management needs. That steward is an extension of the evangelist in the domain. That steward is working closely with the product owner, but that steward is a very key role. And if you looked at that organization chart, a slide before, you saw that steward appearing in all of those back-end IT operations areas where work needs to get done to drive one of these projects to completion. So that person is really a very strong senior architect, gets the business, not quite as much as the evangelist, and certainly not quite like the product owner. What the API management team is doing in that environment is they're the harbor, they're the repository for that kind of expertise. But the way it's set up is they don't own project management completion for any of these domain projects. Those domain projects are agile execution projects that are within those domains, and the API management team sitting in the middle of the cooperative is really sort of a resource. They're a resource. All right, next slide, please. Okay, we'll take a brief look at DevOps execution. And so next slide, please. So this is the problem. Let's take a look at what happens when nobody's monitoring APIs. First, the API fails, and the applications relying on the API fails, which impacts the user experience. So, search for API outage on Twitter, and you'll see a stream of discussions happening every day from small to large organizations that are suffering from those API outages. We did a blog a couple months ago about the pressure that COVID was putting on APIs, but the internet and subsequently APIs. So the question is what are we doing about it? So, we may have a DevOps team scramble to find the root cause, and eventually, the issue to the API, but by then, the damage is done. So it's all about your brand reputation. And so most applications, now have hundreds of APIs, which makes remediation time consuming. So, really what we're talking about here is the funding to Agile project being stood up, to now we're gonna push application capabilities through a DevOps orchestration pipeline, and we're gonna get something in production. But that sort of helps. But when you hear about AI ops and when you hear all the new emphasis on monitoring, what it's really about is what's the production monitoring loop back going to be, and who's it going to go to? There were days when many of us, including me, carried a beeper 24/7, and if anything went down, that beeper was ringing, and we immediately knew the way it was. So really, I think in some ways we're going to try to get back to that. Those APIs need to be monitored. What the problems are needs to be decomposed, and the feedback needs to go back not only to developers, but all the way back into Agile stakeholders. So next slide, please. Okay. So you may have seen this graphic before. It's a good one. This is how we characterize the API management lifecycle in the Agile enterprise. There's a modern architecture model which sits in the middle of this. I mean, what you're seeing here is really the characterization of future state. This is where we want to go. All right. This is the execution of this environment is the path that Acme is on. And what this is it's a clear life cycle, and it's required to bring enterprise data to life. So next, please. Okay. So first thing we look at is the API provider side. They need to know what assets they have to work with. I mean, that's critical when they first get asked to do something. A clear plan and strategy and prototype for what the data will look like to consumers needs to appear. Building and publishing the APIs and microservices that will expose the enterprise data quickly and efficiently. Testing the new services. How do these, and this is really, we're talking about primarily about internal developers here. And these are the kind of people that are feeding off of that cooperative set of resources. Securing these APIs and the apps that will use them from threats and vulnerabilities. What's the plan for that? So next, please. So we went to, but that's okay. That's okay. We'll go with that. All right. So first, let's talk about the API consumers. Obviously they need help to discover, what's out there and what's available to them. In my view, I mean, the state of the art in our business is a strong developer portal that both internal developers as well as external developers can go and see what's out there, easily test, and then go tell their management how fast they turn something around. So the other key thing in this picture now is what you're looking at is all of those steps in the chain, in the loop, and all of the consumer and provider goals. All of this ties back to the 4 key areas in which we work with our customers. DevOps, which is, we've been talking about it. Value ops, value ops is really measured on the business side before you even get something into the development chain. And AI ops, which, the term AI, as we can talk about that, but essentially AI ops refers to how do you effectively monitor things that are in production and instantly inform the stakeholders on that of their condition. And then how do you secure things? So, and so this is the continuous API management cycle sort of summarized. Next slide, please. Okay, got time for extra credit?
Well, we do kind of want to stay on schedule here. Is it something that you can cover really quickly?
Yeah, no, I'll just show it. There's a DevOps maturity assessment process. There's a lot of them out there that you can use. So go to the next slide. Bottom line is, and I won't even go through the animation on this. Previously you saw the 4 areas, and so this is one of four pages of continuous integration measures, right? So CI prerequisites or tool use or whatever. And so this is just a way of examining customers' processes, what their people are doing, what the current tools are that they have, and assigning, maturity on where they are on the process. So it's just by way of encouraging folks and is to take your API management approach and lay it in to something like this, because you're not going to get to avoid the DevOps or orchestration movements. So that's all I got. If there's any time for questions, or afterwards, you can submit your questions to Bill, and I'll be happy to take the time to provide any follow-up information you need.
Yeah, we will be taking questions and redirecting them to the appropriate resource after this workshop is over. So thank you very much, John. I think that was a very compelling overview on the concept of API strategy and why it's important to bring everybody together. The next step of API on the API world is API design. And today we have both Jaime and Aran that are going to be talking about the whole concept of, let me just forward this through a little bit, of API design style, specifically REST and CRUD versus GraphQL. So with that, I'm going to ask John to go on mute, and Aran and Jaime, take it away.
Thanks, Bill. You hear me okay? Just checking I've come off mute okay.
Yep, you did.
Cool, thank you. Thanks, John, for your presentation. Been watching that with interest. There's some interesting parts in that. I think you talked about API first. I think that can be really misleading, right? Sometimes it feels like the API builder has got all the power and they build the API and then hope people will come along. And I think it's a lot more than that. I think you did a good job of describing that. But once you know you need an API, you have a number of API styles that you can consider, and that's what Jaime and I are going to look at. Before I kind of go into that in depth, I'll introduce myself and then hand over to Jaime. And Jaime and I decided that in a 2.5-hour session like this, we would break it up a bit and talk. So you will get a look at the kind of conversation that Jaime and I have day to day, which may be a good thing, maybe a bad thing. And also the kind of conversations we have with our customers and people out there doing these APIs. So first of all, some introductions. I think you should be very privileged, actually, before I introduce myself, of how smart the API Academy team is during this time of COVID. I think every single person on this call that's going to turn their camera on is smarter and more well turned out than I've seen them in a long while. So I think thank you for everyone. We've got dressed, we've showered, we've shaved, and done our hair. So who am I? My name's Aran White. I have been in this space since around 2005 when I was working at IBM in the WebSphere middleware space, and we acquired IBM. We acquired Data Power, and at that point I moved into that team, and I've been working with web services or REST or SOAP or all the other acronyms we know ever since. I spent a good amount of time at Layer 7, and then through the acquisition of CA and Broadcom, I'm where I am. Most of that time I was in a pre-sales role, either as a pre-sales consultant or a pre-sales manager, director. And kind of hot off the press news from this week is that I've been asked to head up the product management team for Layer 7 as of as of now. And as a key part of that team is me and Jaime will be working together, which is great for me and great for the product, I think. So yeah, over to Jaime, introduce himself.
Yeah, thanks, Aran. And thank you, John. I really appreciate some of those artifacts around the organization of the API program. So my name is Jaime Ryan. I have a very similar background to Aran. We worked together at IBM on data power, and then through Layer 7, through the CA and Broadcom acquisitions, and I'm in kind of product management and strategy. So I want to dive right into these kind of API design styles. John talked about the API first strategy a few times. It was also one of the questions. Question number 2, building products based on APIs that target your developers' interests. So building them on top of existing applications, existing data sources, and these become the critical component. So what you build and how you build it really matters. So we're going to kind of deep dive on that. We're going to be talking about API design styles. Goal is to spend a good amount of time on REST and newer options like GraphQL. Talk about some of the considerations necessary for each when you're deciding what to use for any given project. And we've only got one slide to throw up as a framework for some of the topics that we will be talking about today. So you'll have plenty of time to read it, to screenshot it, to think about it. But mainly this is going to be a conversation. So it's good to understand kind of the drivers for each of these, the implementation highlights, the tooling available for each of these different styles for both the API providers and the API consumers, the governance models, security threats, and how to mitigate those threats, the applicable security frameworks designed to overcome those threats. So I want to start off, I said we were going to talk about the newer API options, and yet we still put up a slide that has SOAP on it. And so this deck isn't left over from 2009. SOAP is actually on there. So Aran, why the heck is SOAP still a topic of conversation here?
Yeah, I mean, when SOAP came out, that's like the time you and I met each other, right? That's how long we've known each other. You know, I kind of think SOAP. Do we call it history? Do we call it legacy? You know, I hear that term a lot. You know, our legacy stuff, and people are no longer talking about the mainframe; they're talking about SOAP. But you know, have people really got rid of all their SOAP services? I think the answer I have to say from the people we work with is no. They really haven't. So it tends not to be chosen, thankfully, for new projects, but it's it's still out there. I often hear the term, I actually heard it this week, web services or just services. I think that's a giveaway that people in that organization still have some SOAP. It's one of those giveaways when they talk about web services. But yeah, I think the reason it's on the slide is that this API design, changing API design has been a journey, and I think some of the things we learned from SOAP we kind of threw out with REST, and to a certain extent some of the things that are in GraphQL have come back to that. So I definitely think it's a journey. We started off with SOAP, tightly defined. It was always, you always knew what you were dealing with, request and response, and we got rid of some of that. We had those really hard days of working with XML schemas and WS security and all those kinds of things. And it was tough. It was really hard. We built businesses on it, right? Trying to make it easier for our customers at all the companies we've worked at. And then REST came along, and REST was a bit more free and easy. And as an Englishman, I might say it's a bit more Californian than English, right? SOAP fitted. We loved SOAP in England, right? Especially if you work with a bank. That was, well, this is brilliant. It suited the way of life. But I think we've started to see a journey within REST where things like Swagger and OpenAPI and those standards have started to realize that some of those things were actually really important, and they made our life easier, especially around the governance and those kinds of things. And now we see GraphQL, and there's a lot of cool things that are in GraphQL, but at the heart of it, there's a schema. And at the heart of SOAP, there was a schema. And it's a very different schema, and we'll talk about, you know, some of the advantages of that and how useful it is, and why that's cool. But you know, that kind of stuck in my mind the first time I saw GraphQL.
Yeah.
But you know, I touched there, Jaime. Like, I think we've gained lots. It feels like a good journey. I think we've gained certain things from GraphQL we didn't have in REST, and from REST we gained things, but we've lost other things as well. So you know, what have we lost? What have we gained in those styles?
Yeah, that's true. I think we've learned a lot along the way, and hopefully we've made some of the right decisions with kind of the way these have evolved. I think broadly, I'd say we've gained a lot of simplicity and ease of use, made things lighter weight, using simple native web technology. We've transitioned from XML to JSON in the process, even though some of the early REST stuff was still XML. But all these things really help with the mobile use cases. That was a big driver for REST, and continues to be a driver for GraphQL, and delivering exactly what the developer wants, putting the hands back in putting the power back in the hands of the developer. So we've also gained a lot of flexibility, which has its pros and cons. So in that transition from SOAP to REST, there are a lot fewer things prescribed for you in REST. Basically because it's a bunch of diverse RFCs and W3C specs that have been repurposed and used together as a set of patterns, rather than kind of a monolith of specifications written specifically for this purpose, which was basically the entire WS Star standards that came out for SOAP and web services. It's almost too many options. There's almost too much flexibility, so everybody has their own interpretation. REST APIs can be CRUD, can be hypermedia, it can be OData. You can probably name a few more. You have lots of choices for what your URIs look like and what message formats you're going to use, and if you're using different media types, naming conventions, and those types of stuff. You have to decide all of those things when you're putting together your API program. You have to write an API style guide, that sort of thing. And so it becomes much more important to have documentation. Before with SOAP, there was a WSDL. You had tools that could use it. Now you're completely flexible, and so you need documentation that kind of describes, okay, how do I access this program? What's the catalog of APIs that I can manage as a provider, or discover as a consumer? And that's where an API portal comes in, like John mentioned in his presentation. So that's kind of what we've gained. What have we lost? Well, we've really lost that governance provided by that big stack of purpose-built specifications. So and governance is reassuring to large organizations that are slow to change. It makes them feel better. It makes them feel more secure. But when developers are pushing back on the high cost and time of development and adoption, they get their way, but then what? We've lost some control with each evolution. Some of these control structures need to be reinvented with each new context. So we have the WS security standards, covered encryption, digital signatures, credential token management, all that stuff. You had SAML and XACML for authorization. You lost that with REST, so it had to be built back up, and now you have OAuth and OpenID Connect and signed JOTs and a bunch of extensions to do all of at least the most important things that you could do around SOAP. GraphQL is actually a little bit more prescribed in how you define schemas and endpoints. I think people recognize that REST was a little too willy-nilly, part of that reaction. But we don't really have a new parallel set of accompanying specifications like we saw with WS Security and their REST equivalent. So you've got simplicity in GraphQL, you've got flexibility in REST, but what does that look like when you actually go to implement those styles? Aaron, you want to cover that?
Yeah, I do. you didn't pull the one acronym that hurt me the most, that caused me the most pain, which was UDDI. Like, do we need UDDI for our REST world? Or I'm so glad that was one of the projects that, you know, we talked about so many things like that, and that never got going. But yeah, I think, you know, first of all, I'm going to give a shout out to the Academy, right? If you're trying to decide which of these API styles is the right one, then Bill, you know, put a plug at the front there for the API Academy. The design certification course covers a lot of these things. I think is a really good, useful way of learning these things and understanding them and getting a certification. And the security one, you know, we'll talk about security in a little while, but security is different for each of these as well, and understanding that is important. So, you know, what did we have with SOAP? Well, you know, it was an XML operational based approach, really, right? It was, I want my service to do this. You know, the hints of the, you know, it was called SOAP actions or SOAP operations. So it was good at it sitting in front of mainframe legacy applications. It was awful for humans to read, right? I mean, I have an envelope, I have a body, I have a schema in there. Maybe I have complex schema tasks. I still have a, you know, you can't see my bookcase. My bookcase is over there. I still have a book on XML and schemas that I can't believe is still in one piece, right? It was a kind of horrible thing to put together if you were making those calls. And then when you added security on top, it just became really difficult to work with. WS Security, WS Secure Conversation, all those things that it built on top just made it harder to read. Debugging was very tough. You know, in the infrastructure, developers wouldn't know what was going on. They often got very pointless responses that had no detail of what the error was. And it was heavy. It was heavy for organizations to run in particular. It was heavy from a security perspective. You know, a lot of things like WS encryption and WS signing were the big parts of what, you know, when we were at Data Power and then Layer 7, we were offloading those things because they were really heavy operations if people wanted to operate them on a large scale.
Yeah, created a whole industry.
Yeah, I mean, that's what we did, right? That was the big part of what we did. We offloaded that security stuff, and you needed lots of infrastructure. Yeah, I mean, we concentrated on one particular part, but your security infrastructure needed to be quite large for this. Your back-end application servers and integration needed to be there. You needed to offload that security gateway. So it was difficult. You know, anyone that ever added encryption, security, you know, signing and WS Secure Conversation to an API or SOAP service knows what we mean. And that's why gateways became the standard and the norm. And it just didn't work, right? When we got to the world of mobile, when Apple changed our lives forever, it just didn't work. The thought of a developer in a new modern mobile application, the first thing they need to do to get data in that, building a SOAP request in Swift or, you know, whatever, you know, however they're building it, was a nightmare. That whole thing didn't work. So REST came along, much more developer friendly in some ways, not always, I don't think, because they no longer have that schema, right? They no longer knew what the API was. So it was friendly for the mobile developer that knew what was going on. JSON started to take over from XML, so we started to see a more human readable format in the messages, and we have that now. I'd still question, my family, my wife in particular, would question how human readable JSON is, but it is more human readable than XML, right? But I'm not going to write a book in JSON. So from an operations perspective, we had things that we all understood. We had a web server. We were using the URI to make calls on entities, right? And as Jaime said, some of the design around APIs became a bit more complex because of REST and the entity model. But if you had an app server or a web server and you had something that could make an HTTP call, you could get going with REST a lot faster. And I think the HTTP verbs, where they were used correctly, made it a lot easier for people to debug and understand what those APIs were and how they would be using them. It seems more lightweight of an infrastructure to put in place. You're not needing to learn schemas and all those kinds of things. But there were things that became more complex, and we'll talk about security later. But suddenly, because of that app-driven part of REST, the mobile app, we have that triangle of the device, the app, the user. Which one do we trust? SOAP, thankfully, was more B2B, service to service, organization to organization. So we needed to evolve that security model. But the stack was simpler to implement. We could use things that had been around for a while, like curl and postman, to make it easier. So there was lots of ease, but lots of choices still that you had to make. REST for me was great in the way it was simple, but you also needed to add things like Jaime said. You needed to add a developer portal, because without that schema, how does a developer really know how to use my API? With SOAP, we had UDDI, right? So there was some simplicity to it that was good, but we had to add some extra things to it to make it work. And one approach that was often talked about, we had a colleague that was the guru on this, right, was hypermedia. That never felt simple to me, Jaime. I don't know about you.
Yeah, no, it's not always quite as simple as you generally think of with REST. I mentioned that flexibility means there's a lot of different approaches, and if you talk to a Restafarian, someone who's religious about the precepts of REST and basing everything on Roy Fielding's dissertation, and if you talk to them, it likely means kind of a hypermedia approach. So instead of focusing on entities like CRUD, the hypermedia approach focuses on applications. So you define the application flow, you use HTTP methods to kind of transition through the states in that application, and then you use these new media types that can represent both kind of the current state of where you are in the application and the next potential application task, the next thing you can do to transition to another state. And if it's done right, it's amazing. It's self-documenting. There's no real need for explicit versioning, because the client's smart about it and can kind of discover along the way. This kind of pure version, it's fantastic in theory, but it's definitely not simple, and not a lot of organizations have really kind of realized that nirvana. Most go with a more pragmatic approach, and it's because it's more difficult to define that workflow and all those content types and stuff up front. There's not a ton of tooling. There's a few popular media types out there, HAL plus JSON, those types of things. But many people are still defining their own. And so if you're coming up with your own media type, the simplicity is kind of out the window. And then more importantly, there's more burden on the consuming application to understand the content, to deal with those dynamic state transitions. I think it's that burden to understand the REST API, even with CRUD, that's part of the reason that GraphQL is increasing in popularity. So those right. Consuming developers want something discoverable, self-documenting, and easy to code against. So what does that GraphQL implementation look like from the provider perspective?
And you described there perfectly what I struggle with hypermedia, right? Like, how I don't know how to make my client that intelligent to do everything and exploit that. And at the heart of GraphQL is the schema, and it kind of feels like a step back. But when you realize how we use that schema in GraphQL, it's actually the real power of it. So, if I think about my SOAP days, when I went on site and I said, hey, put some security on this service, the person that asked me that never knew about the SOAP service at all, but they gave me the WSDL and I worked as a way. And the first time I saw GraphQL, that made me smile that we have a schema. And then I realized, well, actually, it's a schema that I control, right? I can pick what I want the API to come back with. That's fantastic, right? Because one of the first things I did at Layer 7, when I joined Layer 7, I did a proof of concept at a company in the UK, and they had a SOAP service with a canonical message that came back. That meant everything I wanted came back in a 2.5 meg XML file, and I had to parse every one of those that came back. So, GraphQL takes that away. It puts in the hands of that developer the schema is the core part in how that's delivered. But why did we come up with that? Well, a lot of this came from what Facebook did with GraphQL. The amount of data they have, the number of APIs they had, the relationships between them, that's really what GraphQL is out there trying to solve and is solving, right? So that link between the data in a kind of hypermedia way, but bringing it all together in an API that the client can control and define at the time it calls it. So yeah, the core is the schema, but the resolvers are the clever bit. So the schema is the window of what I've got. Here's all my data, and the resolvers are the clever bits that pull that into the schema, and they allow for the definition of integrations and relationships between that data. They can come from disparate data sources, so you're not just talking about databases. You could be making a REST call on the back end, a database call. You could even be fronting a SOAP service in a GraphQL, using it as a facade. So it's a little bit harder than developing a REST service, I would say, internally, but the value of that can become, and we'll talk about how you decide which one in a bit. But so it's a little bit more complex. I think you need a little bit more infrastructure compared to a REST service, but you're talking about a layer that is doing a little bit more than just creating an API. It's doing some orchestration and bringing some of that business value together for you. So yeah, I think I'm in for some use cases, and REST is still the thing there. So we touched a couple of times. I'm wary of time. Jaime, what's the difference in security threats across our choices here and how we design an API?
Yeah, I guess if you've got a GraphQL endpoint that's fronting a REST API that's wrapping a SOAP service, you get all three security threats that you have to deal with all at once. But no, the threats and how you deal with them are an important consideration. John mentioned security. I think that was questions 3, 4, and 5. We get a lot of questions about threats and remediation. So in the SOAP world, it was all about injection, code injection, SQL injection, other threats that can kind of be slipped in through weaknesses in the schema to services that hadn't previously been exposed or quite that open. The other part was, because these were often performance sucking, as you say, giant files, large messages, there were a lot of threats that would overload the backend, overload the XML parser, large messages, recursive messages, things that would cause performance issues by bringing down the backend with maybe even a single message and creating a denial of service. So API gateways were kind of protecting against those types of threats, those injection and schema-based attacks. For REST, we're usually talking about mobile applications that are getting data from a bunch of different sources. Many of the threats are around access control and permissions. You're dealing with delegated authority. If those permissions then can be escalated, you might have breaches. So it needs to be implemented and implemented well to do OAuth and OpenID Connect and all of those things through an API management interface. With GraphQL, the threats are primarily around complexity, the depth of the query, the complexity of the query, how many different systems that's going to go and reach out to. Some of the same issues you had with SOAP, causing performance issues, and so you need to worry about those, do the analysis, and prevent some requests that could provide a problem. So we've seen each of these approaches. They have their pros and cons. How do we decide which ones to use?
Well, let me cover SOAP, right, or SOA, right? Yeah. We don't need to kill it, right? But we should leave it in the areas it is. I think we need to maybe life support's the wrong term, right? But we need to love it and cherish it. But it should be for those legacy things. You may still have products where the off-the-shelf products API is SOAP, and that they're not going to convert it. There's some options, like you said. We can do SOAP to REST. We can do SOAP to GraphQL. But for now, I think there aren't many new use cases. So, SOAP should be avoided as a new thing. And I'm hoping no one on this call's planning to build a new SOAP service anytime soon. I hope I've not offended anyone there. What about REST, Jamie? When would that work?
Yeah, I'd say the same thing about SOAP. There's no need to reinvent the wheel, to redo things if it's all stable, just like the mainframe's not going away. Some SOAP stuff's not going away. For most people on this call, I'm guessing the majority of what you're currently building is REST APIs of one form or another, likely CRUD. I think that should probably still be the instinct, the kind of the first instinct for new development. And then Jay will talk about kind of what doing modern API development means in terms of microservices and the supporting technologies. So what about GraphQL?
Yeah, I mean the Facebook example is great, right? Why was it written? Why was it developed to a certain level? So lots of data, lots of relationships. That makes sense. I think there's some other benefits though that that sometimes we skip over. So the developer experience. This gives the developer a nice way of controlling what they do, how they code. It makes it easier for them to consume more data without kind of having to go off and ask the API provider, right? They can see what's there, they can work out how they want to use it. And I think the developer experience is still a really important part. If you're going to have a successful API, people have to want to use it. If we still all put SOAP services out there, there would be mobile apps not happening right now. So I think they're the most obvious reasons. That the reason that it's kind of interesting, right? The bandwidth one. This stops the number of calls you need to make. I think we're spoiled in the world with, I have a gig internet speed, my cell phone has 5G, I don't worry about that. But there are places in the world where that's still an issue, and there are devices that make that still an issue. So I think that's important. I think that bandwidth thing we can also spin round as well. I think the provider of that API, as we build that API, there is a cost associated with it, and GraphQL can help reduce some of those, right? If you're spinning your API up in a cloud, or you're paying for data going through a network, this can actually reduce the amount of API calls coming into your environment. So it can actually help you scale, reduce costs, and those kinds of things. So I think, where there's complexity, where you've got very chatty APIs with relationships between them, moving to GraphQL or implementing GraphQL can be, a key part. Bill, I've seen you pop up in my screen. Have we got like a minute or two for Jamie to mention some of the other areas that people might consider when they're talking about
Fire
this?
away.
Cool.
I'll cram it down to 30 seconds. So just, some of the other approaches that we're keeping our eyes on. Event-driven architectures are becoming more popular. They show a lot of promise in these scenarios. They actually let you do some of the orchestration and interaction between microservices. So it's one way to overcome that complexity instead of building layers of services that do all that orchestration kind of manually. It lets each kind of independently delivered and deployed system deal with transactions asynchronously. So that's pretty interesting to us. And then gRPC is interesting, but not yet widely adopted, especially outside the enterprise data center. There's lots of performance benefits, but they're maximized when you own both ends of the pipe. So until there's more tooling that kind of allows easy consumer discovery and human readable translations of what's a binary format being passed around, I think it'll be slow to take off. So I know we're over time. Let's give somebody else a chance to talk.
Great, thanks guys. I think that was a really interesting discussion, especially bringing back SOAP. So we've talked about API strategy, we've talked about API design. Now let's move to the next level. Microservices have gotten a lot of buzz over the last couple of years. So API Academy member Jay is gonna talk a little bit about implementation methods. I'm gonna change the screen over to you. Give me 1 second here. Okay.
Are we getting the right screen, I hope?
We are. You're good to go.
Okay, good. All right, hi folks, I'm Jay Thorne. I've been working in this space since 2003, so it's 17 very long years. And just like Jaime and Aran, I went through the soap wars as well. But let me start. My conversation is really about an emerging space, and that is APIs, microservices, and mesh. First of all, APIs are not microservices, and I think that's needs to be clear as to what they are. This is going to draw back a little bit to what John was talking about. APIs are definitely an expression of business value. So that what that means for me is the value that is available to the end customer, something that a business leader would care about. That's the kind of thing that becomes an API. A microservice, for instance, let me finish actually with the APIs. Necessarily, you have to implement some level of your business rules within your APIs, or really it's a microservice. If you have an API that's a very direct, manipulation of some low-level data, I'd describe that a little bit more as a microservice, only because of the data centricity rather than the functional centricity. I often think of APIs as being functions and microservices as being, data. Similarly, microservices are a kind of infrastructure that are called by APIs. And, as simple of things as CRUDs on standard database tables and things like that, big candidates for microservices, pure lookup things like looking up addresses and looking up all those other kinds of things. That sort of thing can also be defined as a microservice. And usually called by the implementer of the business rules. And then lastly, and this is a little bit pejorative, so forgive me, anybody who's a big fan of service meshes, but in many ways it's plumbing. It replaces in so many ways the pieces that we used to have to build by hand. And, doing the same kind of history lesson that Aran and Jaime did, when we started this in 2003, there was an awful lot of conversations with the load balancer team and with the firewall team and with the security infrastructure team and with the security operations team and with this team and that team. And many things that are done by that can be implemented with rules now, and they're used by the APIs and microservices to connect. So, just putting things in the roles, APIs are what you front to your direct partners and your customers. You use your own microservices. There are cases, easily, I can name them, exceptions to this rule where you want to expose a microservice, for sure. But at the same time, for the most part, the API that you expose is what your business leader cares about. So the evangelists and the chief digital officers and people like that, the APIs are the value. I was having a conversation with a partner in the transportation business, and while the number of API calls going to the OAuth endpoints and to the, look up the postal code or zip code systems were hit heavier than the base APIs, the real value came from, their ability to, ask for a shipment. I want, a truck to show up at this location and pick up this package. So that means to just position where we're coming from, starting from John's conversation and going through, the various styles of API design. It doesn't really matter what kind of API, whether it's SOAP or GraphQL or REST. It's a business construct construct that provides business value. And I think that's a crucial thing to note, is unless you're providing some level of the business logic within that thing, you're relying on people to duplicate your internal business logic, and that's fraught with peril around, enforcement of your, the business rules. So we took a persona-based approach to this when we were defining it. And so when I looked at who cares, so a chief digital officer and an API owner really are invested in the success of that. They care deeply that this API, and it's their business, right? It really is. In most people in this role, of course, the digital business is growing very quickly. Team members are people like the app developers, the API developers, the Scrum team managers. All of those people care a lot about the composition, right, that makes up that. Now, composition is a really important term here, especially when we start talking about the difference between an API and a microservice, because in many ways, an API can be thought of, especially in these modern design systems, as a composition of multiple microservices. And so we're going to talk about the enterprise architect, we're going to talk about the app developers, and we're going to talk about the operations people. We really care about what it is that they need to do their job. So let's talk about the microservices now, the tools in the chain, right? So the enterprise architect here has to design something efficient. And really, there's nobody who gets to develop, a complete brand new system. There's no rip and replace. We're all adults here. There's no way that you can say to yourself, there is a way to just completely re-implement everything from scratch. No one gets the budget to do that. So you need to be able to scale. And what's really interesting there is the scaling that needs to be possible is not just scaling of the API. You need to be able to scale your teams. And one of the things that was told to me a couple of years ago is an API is the product of a business unit, but a microservice is the product of a Scrum team. And if you really want a Scrum team to be able to be scalable, what you can do is, if you decompose correctly the microservices, and the output of that one microservice becomes doable by a team, a small team. The big value then is if you have a microservice that's self-encompassed, produced by a single team, then by design, it means that you can probably scale those things individually at production. This has an operational side that I want to talk about in a bit, but I want to finish with these rules. Now, there's an app developer, and as an app and API developer, you really have the business rules as your problem, right? These business rules can be as simple as, well, this is a loan application, so, there's a bunch of required fields, right? This is, the address has to at least be something remotely accurate, so we should probably run address validation against the zip code. And really, at the end of the day, this is the value. The encapsulating of business rules into something that consumes perhaps a whole bunch of microservices. Yes, absolutely. But what's crucial to note is that that's really the value. And back to an earlier point made, you need to be able to discover and use the microservices that the rest of the teams have produced. So mesh to me is many things. A registry, possibly a load balancer, possibly a router, possibly a trust manager, depending on which one you choose. You know, establishing SSL certificates between points, kitchen sink if you need that. And Bob's one of the people that cares a lot about meshes and stuff like that, because, you know, back in the day, in the 2000s, this stuff was done by hand by large teams, right? And now operations and configuration as code is such a big deal. And one of the things that meshes bring to the table is really a lot of those operational concerns as infrastructure, as code, repeatability. And so initially, of course, you have to get the bytes to the right place, and, you know, load balancers and firewalls and things like that. I wouldn't say that meshes ever implement firewalls, but by dint of only ever publishing, you know, a limited list of ports, it's effectively the same thing as a firewall. And then after you've got the routing, you've got this horizontal scaling of the individual microservices. And back to what we were saying earlier, the idea that there's an individual microservice, right, that has an individual team creating it, and therefore the scaling shouldn't really require too many other components, and that's part of the definition. And, you know, there's a couple of great seminars that you can take and courses that you can take, and one of the main points around microservices is often the idea that they only are this one microservice is the only manipulator of a certain kind of data, and anything else that needs to use that data needs to call the microservice instead of the tables or the data store, whatever it is underneath. And, you know, load balancing and ingress controllers provide you that kind of stuff, and that's one of the features of what meshes do for you. Now, I wouldn't say that that's the only way to do it, because, you know, we've seen many situations just recently where people have still the corporate load balancer and, you know, the geographic load balancing capabilities, and then those are sent to individual containerized environments, and there's load balancing and ingress controllers on each of those environments. The other thing that's really interesting, what meshes can do for you is a certain level of enabling of infrastructure as code by, instead of having to, like the way it used to be, you'd have to define the pool for each and every load balancer. And the way that it kind of works in a mesh world is the very active bringing up a service defines it as an entry in the registry, and now you can send messages to the registry, and the tools themselves, you know, give you this horizontal scaling and load balancing via this same registry. So in many ways, it starts to make those pieces be dynamic. They come from environment, they come from your own scaling, and there's no question of, you know, the late night calls on December 31st that I personally attended, where we have to manipulate firewall rules, we have to manipulate load balancer rules, we have to manipulate authorization authentication in a dozen different systems in order to add 2 new nodes to my scale up because something happened, right? We need to scale up, and there's a big event tomorrow, and so here we are in a war room. And the thing that's really interesting about these capabilities is a lot of those dots become connected through really infrastructure as code. And also the code themselves, the very active scaling up an individual pod of capability adds to that registry entry, adds to the scaling, adds to the load balancing. And this, especially compared to the alternative, is a huge, huge change. I cannot tell you how many calls I have been on where there had to be 30 different people in these calls where we're manipulating load balancer rules and firewall rules in real time, instead of hitting +++ in a UI that says, I need a couple more of these, and then having all the pieces fall into place. And then, information security happens. And so, one of the things that's interesting is a couple of the meshes, Istio comes to mind immediately, implement point-to-point secrecy. I wouldn't call it security because there's no real access rules, but it does allow you to provision certificates on an on-demand basis that are trusted in the point-to-point communication. And I think that's a pretty powerful thought. Overall, what does that mean? It means that you get a very easy to use point-to-point security using tokens that are pretty difficult to spoof or capture, because they're really only used point-to-point within the system, and they're created on demand and they're destroyed on demand. So this kind of overall secrecy is one of the things that I find very powerful about using meshes. This used to be a lot of work, getting signed certificates signed by a cartel certificate and all that other kind of stuff. These kinds of pieces are powerful, but they're still plumbing. They're still connecting dots. It's not the core of your business functionality. Does Cynthia, the CDO, care whether you're using self-signed certificate on demand or whether you're using public search? And the answer is she doesn't. She doesn't even know that they exist. So this point-to-point certificate provisioning mechanisms, very useful, very fast, saves a lot of money, certainly saves a lot of time. And what this gives you is a kind of prescriptive secrecy and environment as code. And that gives you a level of infrastructure independence. And why would this matter? Well, infrastructure independence is one of the places where I would say in the past we haven't had. Even if you go to a cloud provider, you sometimes get stuck into an individual cloud provider's capabilities. And I'm not throwing stones. We use various cloud providers in our organization, but having it so that we don't have to use the one set of tools, and the names of the companies out there that have public cloud infrastructure are legion, but the possibility of your own cloud, your private cloud, so virtually hosted, not on-prem, but still under your control, versus under a public cloud provider's control, Amazon, Azure, Google, those kind of people. So this kind of tool can start to connect those dots where you don't have to use the tools provided exclusively by that organization and get yourself a kind of lock-in. And so that means that the provider of the compute power is no longer a single point of failure or of coupling. And coupling is a very important thing to me. I've blogged about it recently, where you really want to have the combination of low coupling, but high coherence. You want to have it so everything's doing the same kind of stuff. Infrastructure as code is about coherence, is about making things work the same way, but you don't want to have it so that an outage at Amazon takes down your entire system, right? You want to have it that seamlessly your Google system or your Azure system takes over that load, or you can scale up that system to take over more of the load during the outage. Perhaps you've got competitive dollar figures associated with each of these providers that make it more preferable to use one over the other. Lastly, I want to try and put it together, and I got 10 minutes to do this, so hopefully I can make this happen. So, the Chief Digital Officer has defined Acme Loan App as the future of the business. But brick and mortar does continue to exist. There's still going to be storefronts, still going to be people using this kind of stuff. The enterprise architect and the app developer finally agree on the features of the API. Now, the features of the API, for instance, in a GraphQL, in some ways, you don't have to define that all up front. You can add new resolvers and add new features to the API without fundamentally changing the APIs. It's one of the reasons why I like GraphQL. But there might be reasons, for instance, specifically on Acme Loan App, where regulatory concerns require that you don't have a discoverable API. Instead, you must have a set in stone API. So there's good reasons for both. And I'm not going to say that, Acme Loan App has to be GraphQL or cannot be GraphQL. But my experience has been that regulatory concerns can sometimes, joggle your elbow when it comes to how you want to design stuff. Certainly from my perspective, I don't want to have it that if I have a major auto sales organization using my loan app, I don't want to have it that if I work with them, I can never revision my API, right? So GraphQL might have been able to do that, but at the same time, there might be a good reason why regulatorily I cannot do that. And so I have to live with publishing APIs twice or using in API resolution to multiple backends, for instance. And then the other concept here is we've got this backends for front ends requirement. Web presence has a specific set of things, usually functional. Partners might have a more data-focused API. There's lots of reasons why these things happen. But this is where the enterprise architect and the developer have to agree on what you're going to do, right? You have to figure out what features need to be present. And it's pretty close, pretty certain that internal only tooling should be able to consume similar APIs, but maybe you want to have it differently, and maybe that's keyed on credentialing, maybe it's keyed on API key, maybe it's keyed on many other things. But it's pretty clear that you don't want to have them be completely different from each other, because getting one API to come up is hard enough without adding multiple ones. And then there's the question of mobile. And this is one of the reasons, harkening back to the GraphQL conversation, that's one of the reasons why microservices also, I don't think, are appropriate in the mobile space, because they're chatty by necessity. They're small, they're by the very name. And so, getting an API call from my mobile phone to my office is a minimum of 150 milliseconds, and it's not due to the server being somewhere else. There's just so many networks involved and so many routers involved and so many pieces involved. I don't want to spend that 150 milliseconds 30 times in a row for microservices call. I'd rather spend that 150 milliseconds in a single bigger call, which brings me back to the point of APIs being compositions and not necessarily the low-level pieces. So mobile, especially, as sensitive as it is to latency, and that's actually a really important point. I am very sensitive to latency. When a function in my phone takes more than 5 seconds, I'm hitting cancel and resend. And 5 seconds in the SOAP days was pretty normal. And now in the days of mobile, I want milliseconds. I want hundreds of milliseconds at most. And so one of the points that Jaime made around asynchronous APIs, with being able to send off the request and asynchronously wait, technologies like MQTT, WebSockets, Kafka, and all these kinds of event-driven architectures really start to create a different way of interacting that allows you to provide a better user experience. But for me, the user experience matters an awful lot, and that's why the API should be reflecting what you want people to be able to do. And that's why an API is about functions to me and less about pure data calls. And that means to decompose this, the enterprise architect and the app and API developer have to split it off into microservices. Otherwise, how are they going to scale the teams? How are they going to make use of multiple Scrum teams and things like that? And that then implies that some services will probably need to scale more than others. And that's where we bring in the operational side of this. And then the the app developer and the ops people they define the mesh implementations, because the scaling of the individual pieces starts to really, really matter. And what does that do? Well, first and foremost, it kind of brings things into flexibility. You get the multiple cloud providers, you get all of the pieces that bring in the scalability, not just of the applications, but of your organization, because you have to be able to utilize everyone in your team effectively for this to work. Now, that's really all I had. So I managed to come in on time, which is kind of surprising for me. So Bill, if you're listening here, you might want to take this over, and I can hand it back to you.
Great. I will actually change the presenter in just one moment. Thank you very much. That was very informative. So we have talked about API strategy. We've talked about API design. We just talked about, Jay gave a great implementation methodology. So what do you do after you actually get everything implemented? And I asked a member of Broadcom, who's not a member of API Academy, but he certainly is honorarily one, but he's knows more about API testing and monitoring than anybody I've met, and he's able to share it coherently, which is a rare thing to do. So Bryan's going to take you through not just API testing and monitoring, but continuous API testing and monitoring. So let me make you the presenter, and you are good to go, Bryan.
Okay, let me share the correct screen.
That's always a good thing. You're up.
Excellent. Thanks, Bill. Welcome, everybody. My name is Bryan Whitmarsh, and I'm going to talk to you about testing. Now, hang on. We're the last 30 minutes. Hopefully, you're still awake and coherent. I'll try to make this interesting. I have a few stories that I'll tell you that relate to hopefully making this coherent as to fair, why test APIs, how to test APIs, what's a good balance, and all that. All right. First question is that we should answer is why test or monitor APIs in the first place? And I'm a simple guy, right? I live in Idaho, so I'm out here in the boonies, and I keep things simple. And in the end, all of this that we're talking about is really to help our customers have smiles on their faces, right? We want to help companies have happy customers that are providing great feedback, great reviews. Cynthia, as the Chief Digital Officer, this is paramount for her. She wants to have 5 stars from a rating perspective, wants to have some great reviews, those types of things. And we need to always remember why we're doing this. We're doing this to provide a great user experience and to grow our customer base. So with that said, let's get into APIs. Now, we've been talking about APIs, and you're API experts, and so no surprise here. What are APIs has been defined 15 times already today. But when we think about them as being these essential building blocks of our applications, and it's not just for internal, but it's also for external applications. It's not just for our internal users or app developers, it's also for third parties to be able to use it and leverage it. And when we think about what we want out of our API, we don't just want to make sure it's always available. We want to make sure that it's also performing. When you talk about having high scale, you get, and Jay talked about, on your mobile phone, if you have to wait more than a few seconds, I'm exactly the same way. Anything that takes me long, I'm switching, and today I'm just, if consistently an app is taking too long, I just throw it away, right? I'm going to download the next application and get a better user experience. So it's very important to make sure that it's not only up, the APIs are available, they are performing adequately, and then even more important is that they're responding with the right information. And we need to be continually checking to make sure that the APIs are providing the right data. If I'm, for example, we're going to talk about Acme, and Acme is in the financial space, and I am using their mobile app or using their web interface, and I check, click on check my balance, and all of a sudden I get like a negative 10,372. Well, the API that made the call, it responded. It responded quick, but it responded with the wrong data. And at that point, I'm very stressed out. What's going on? We need to make sure that the integrity of the data that's being returned is accurate, and we need to be continually checking on that. Now, when we talk about kind of the balance of testing, this is a customer example. Now, you're going to be different, but just from a customer's perspective, someone that we've worked with in the past, their pyramid of how they're testing was the one on the left here. And we talk about unit testing was very small. And when I think of unit testing as like documentation, everybody hates to do it. You need to do it because you need to have documentation. But if I'm coding and I'm in a hurry, I don't want to take the time to create a unit test as well. And so in a lot of cases, these unit tests, they just get pushed to the side and not done. API testing in this customer's example was very low as well, 3% of their testing balance. And then a heavy test balance was at the UI test, the UI level. And, this is, probably a center of excellence team, or this is a QA team that is leveraging user interface testing, where they're going through and they have user stories. They want to make sure the user stories work. For Acme, it may be applying for a loan or whatever is a very popular user flow. Now, that's not the recommended balance from a testing perspective. What we want is something more so on the right-hand side. And I know that these three pillars aren't just the only type of testing scenarios. Obviously, you still always have some type of manual testing. You have user acceptance testing. There's other bits that make up, but from a big bucket perspective, you really want unit testing to be a high percentage of what kind of tests are being done from an API development perspective. And if you can catch it early, unit test is a very small, you're testing a little piece of the function, and if you can test that early and find any issues, then it costs less versus later in the cycle. API testing, which we're focusing on today, you definitely you want a large balance of API testing for the reasons that we've talked about. And you think about that kind of as your meat and potatoes. You want to be able to ensure that, maybe not at the very small level and not at the high level, but in the medium, you want to make sure that you're able to guarantee that these APIs are running, they're up, and they're highly available. And then, UI testing, you want to be able to test user flows. Now, UI testing can be expensive. Our UIs always change, and when change happens to UIs, a lot of times it breaks your UI test, and so you end up having the most popular user flows leveraged from a UI testing perspective. So there's gaps there. You don't want to rely heavily on UI testing. Now, my story here that I want to give you is I am in the middle of, I live in a log home, right? I'm in Idaho, kind of like Daniel Boone, but I live in a log home, surprise, surprise. And when you, from a UI testing perspective, you look at my home, it looks great, right? It's log, it's, it's not really, it still has stain on it, it looks good. But if you, as we are getting ready to stain the house, is we started sandblasting away the old stain and kind of the rough parts of the logs, we realized that there was rot on some individual logs. And think about those individual logs as being the APIs. They're the building blocks of the house. From a high UI perspective, the house looked fine. From a low perspective, the nails hopefully are holding or whatever from a unit testing perspective. But you need to make sure that you have that visibility into the building blocks of your application and make sure you're testing them. Now, Acme, company that we talked about, they're in the financial space. Cynthia is concerned because there's these other small little companies out there, these SaaS companies, and they are providing easy ways to exchange cash between users. And it starts off small, right? You lose customers very slowly in a lot of cases. And so she's concerned that, hey, if users out there, consumers, they like this application, and sure, it's only doing cash exchange today, but what's going to happen in the future? Are they going to start to add some loan services? Are they going to add other features? And then all of a sudden, my core business moves away. Now, back in the day, we used to make banking decisions, at least I did. Basically, my dad, he always banked with this one bank. And so he took me down as a kid, and I got that cool little savings account slip thing. And, I never thought about changing my bank until recently. And I can base who I'm going to do my financial transactions with based on the user experience of the applications that are being provided. So Cynthia is very concerned about this. So she wants Acme to have some type of cash exchange offering. It needs to be web and mobile. It needs to allow for easy transition of money from one person to another. And it's going to have about 50 core APIs, and it's going to be made up of about 20 third-party APIs as well. Now, third-party APIs is a key component of a lot of applications, and something that in a lot of cases is overlooked. All right, now you've got your players. I've got my sketch drawing of the infinity loop, which is our development lifecycle. And I'm going to go through and play out a few scenarios. Now, this isn't all the scenarios, but this is just highlighting a few of the scenarios. And I draw on personal experience of how some of this flow, being in product management for a long time, you get these great stories. So Christine, she is the enterprise architect, and hopefully she's involved in kind of the planning of creating these APIs. What type of API we're going to use. We've talked about the different types of APIs. Hopefully, maybe Christine is using some modeling technology to model the application so that then she can do continuous testing and have the tests generated for her. But Christine starts off the process in the planning phase as the enterprise architect. Now, Eric is going to get picked on a lot today. I apologize, Eric, but you're going to get picked on. Now, Eric is the API owner, and in this case, you may call it something different, or this role may not exist or doesn't have the same responsibility. But for this case, Eric is an API owner, and the API owner, he's going to own that API from creation to production. And so Eric's going to be doing the development of this API. And he begins, developing the API. Hopefully he's being diligent and, writing his unit testing inside of the development process. He's got all his unit tests, and Suzanne, who is the Scrum Master, right, the enforcer, they're in a stand-up a few days into this project. And Suzanne's been looking at the reports of the builds and has noticed that Eric has had a lot of failures recently in the build process. So his unit tests are not passing. They're having to go back. So Suzanne kind of brings the hammer down on Eric and says, hey, you need to shape up. You need to write more efficient code. Maybe you need some code reviews. But there's an importance of testing at that point, right? You want to make sure that at the early stages that our tests are being created, and we're fixing any problems early on. And obviously, if it's breaking the build process, it's going to be addressed. Like I said, Eric's going to get picked on. Now, Thomas in QA, the life cycle of this development of the API has gotten a little bit further down the road. And Thomas is in QA. And Thomas wants to make sure that what Eric is developing is scalable. Because Cynthia said, hey, this is going to be, people are going to love it. They're going to use it. Thomas ran some scale testing from an API perspective and threw up, let's say, 2.3 million users against Eric's logon API. He's created a few APIs. One of them is logon, and you're going to need to log on to these applications. So Thomas kicks it back to Eric and says, hey, Eric, I've seen that your API is not scaling. You need to work on improving the scalability because Cynthia is going to get mad at us. Okay. All right. Now Jim jumps on board. Jim is the app developer. Let's say Jim is developing the mobile application, which he's using in mobile and web. A lot of times they're using the same APIs. But Jim, from a app developer's perspective, he is working on a part of his application that is the add funds. Want to add funds to your application, and he is getting an inaccurate response code, inaccurate data. So the data integrity of Eric's API is in question. So he kicks it back because of testing. He knows that early testing, I see there's issues. Eric, I need you to fix and make sure that this add funds API is providing the right data. All right, we're getting a little bit further on. We're starting to get close to the actual release of the APIs and of the applications. But Nate from the Center of Excellence team, he likes to use these GUI tools, and he is very conscious of the user flows through the application. He wants to make sure there's a great user experience, and he has been tasked to make sure that from a GUI functional perspective, that there's some process flows that are very important that need to be followed and need to make sure that they're not failing. And one of his tests that he's created has been triggered to show that when someone actually goes through the UI, logs in, steps through the UI, obviously, hopefully that's all automated, that the balance that's coming back from Jim's application is failing, right? It's trying to get a balance. Again, people start to panic when they see balance failing or inaccurate balance data. So he's kicking it back to Jim and letting Jim know that, hey, you are either calling this API wrong or you're doing something wrong that needs to be resolved. That was obviously captured through early testing. All right, now we're in the release phase, and Cynthia, again, our Chief Digital Officer, she is in charge of pretty much everything to do digital at Acme. And she is running a campaign and that is trying to get as many people, I think she gave away 10 Canadian dollars for the first person that signed up. And now it's not US dollars, but it's Canadian dollars. So there was a lot of people that jumped. Sorry, I was just a little humor at a Canadian border, but no. So Canadian dollars, tons of people want to sign up for it. And all of a sudden, she's reading the reviews on the application, and they're showing this app is bad. I tried to create an account, I got an error. So Cynthia contacts the app owner, and there's a web app owner and a mobile app owner. I conveniently called one of them Bryan, which is me. Cynthia gets a hold of me and says, hey, people aren't able to sign up. This is bad. They have bad reviews. This is going to kill us if we don't resolve this issue quickly. Now, it flows downhill, right? So Bryan talks to Thomas in QA and said, did you scale test this user creation API? And Thomas said, yes, I did, and can show the results and when it was run. And then obviously Thomas contacts Eric and says, hey, we got a problem here if code needs to be changed because all the tests were done appropriately. All right, now in operations, Bob jumps on board. And Bob is monitoring the uptime, monitoring the stability of the APIs. And pretty much every API he's monitoring. And he's finding out that the reload of funds for the API is taking longer. It's slow. And and that's from a web perspective. So he talks to Jane, who owns the web mobile app. And Jane needs to figure out, okay, how do I resolve that so that I'm not getting a slow performance? Again, the API testing in production, obviously just as important, if not more important, to get the feedback loop into the development lifecycle. And then we got Frank. I wanted to use everybody in our personas. So Frank is the service reliability engineer, And Frank is studying the analytics of all the API testing results that come back. And he's noticed that there's a 2% increase in test failures from the last release. So Frank calls up Bryan and says, Bryan, I need you to stop feature development. I need you to prioritize on quality, stability. I'm okay with giving up some new features or pushing them for a later date. We have to have a very reliable solution. And from my API testing, I can tell that the trend is in the wrong direction. So Frank gets involved. Now, we covered everybody. And at this point, everybody's feeling pretty confident. And so everybody's got a green box around them. And, things are good. But then, one bad, say the play on words, one bad API can ruin the whole user experience. And this is actually a user experience that I have experienced myself because I was using one of these services and I'd signed up for an account and I had walked through a user flow that isn't the main user flow. I was going through and I was adding, you can add funds to your account so that it directly withdraws from the funds. And I was using a third-party source for the fund to basically add funds to my cash account or PayPal account or whatever generic account you want to call it. And I went to add the funds and I got this 404 error. I got some HTTP error that did not complete. Something went wrong. I tried it again. I'm like, okay. And being a application product manager, I'm like, okay, I'm going to cut them some slack. I'm going to wait. They surely have detected that I'm having problems, and I am going to then try this again in a few days. When I went back, I tried again in a few days. And obviously, this was a user flow that they're UI testing, and obviously they weren't testing every single API, because if they would have been testing all their internal and third-party APIs, they would have known this was a problem. And eventually, I just thought, okay, I'm going to try another solution. I was on my mobile device, so I went out, found one that had good reviews and that some of my other friends were using to exchange funds. I downloaded it, and hey, it worked fine, and now that's the one I'm using. And so we have to think about Jose. Jose is the user. Jose is frustrated because Acme did not invest in 100% coverage of API testing. And like we see here, one bad app hole can ruin the whole user experience. Now, that kind of completes my scenario, talking about Acme giving a use case based story. And we obviously, I've talked about testing and we talked about we want to make sure that it's automated and that you're deploying good continuous testing practices from the early stages of making sure that you're testing at the unit level and throughout the entire life cycle. And that's the key. Before, back in waterfall days, we would try to release something and we'd get, okay, I'm ready to release, and then you get to the QA bottleneck. You don't want to have the QA bottleneck. And you want to make sure that you're sprinkling testing throughout the development lifecycle. But then don't forget about production. And that's the whole part of DevOps, is when you get to ops, you want to make sure that you are getting that feedback, you're monitoring in production so that you can actually get that back into the development lifecycle and continually improve. All right, hopefully you're still awake. Hopefully I didn't lose too many of you. This was a great session. I appreciate it. I wish I was in person. Actually, I like living in Idaho, so I'm okay with being in my home office. But I do want to get out here eventually. But thank you for your time. Bill, do you want to go ahead and give your closing remarks and how we can maybe ask questions if anybody has questions and so on?
Yeah, thank you very much, Bryan. That was really good, and I knew it would be. So thank you guys for sticking around for 2.5 hours. We did try to keep it aggressively on time, as the members of the Academy will tell you. I really appreciate John from HCL talking about API strategy. I think that Aran and Jaime's session on API design was very well coordinated. Thank you, Jay, for the microservices session. And of course, Bryan, thank you. As I mentioned at the very beginning of this, we really do appreciate that you came to our virtual workshop. We are going to do this again in September for EMEA and APJ. And we absolutely want to see you next year face-to-face or in person at a live API Academy workshop. If you do have any questions, go ahead and type them in. And as I said, we're not going to answer them live online, but we are going to send them off to the right person who will address them for you. Again, this session will be available later on today on both the link that you used to get to this morning or this afternoon, as well as on the API Academy. And with that, I'm going to draw it to a close. Thank you very much once again for attending. We really do appreciate it. Thank you.